Good morning, Dan and Amy. And I was rather stunned by this comment from one Mike Barnicle, who is a lefty on that, frankly, unwatchable program, Morning Joe. But I happened upon this clip. Mike Barnicle reacting to the the ceasefire that wasn't yesterday, and then it's reconstituted back and forth. But the bottom line is the reestablishment by the Assad regime of control over Aleppo and thus long-term control over Syria with the help of the Russians. Mike Barnicle saying this about the vaunted UN.
Another thing that's clearly evident from the past 5 years is they should just shut down the United Nations. Just shut it down. Because they do nothing. They've done so little in this regard.
Mike, thank God you said that. You know what they do? They come here in September and they have parties. That's all they do.
Wow. Strong statements from No Labels Joe and lefty Mike Barnicle on the Morning Joe program. I mean, when Donald Trump was suggesting things like this and even kind of recalibrating them to say, well, not pull out of NATO, but I want other countries that are member nations to pay their proportional share.
Right.
He was treated as some, rube who didn't know what he was talking about and was a danger to Western civilization. And now you've got Mike Barnicle saying the U.S. saying that, well, not just the U.S. should pull out, they should shut the UN down. Wow. Should they? Well, for more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Robert Charles. He is a former Assistant Secretary of State in the George W. Bush administration, and he's now the president of the Charles Group. Mr. Charles, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you.
So what about that reaction coming from unusual quarters to the totally ineffectual administration and Western policy with respect to the Assad regime and the atrocities going on and ongoing in Syria for the past 5 years?
So, I mean, it's a very serious topic, but I have to sort of chuckle at that sort of a comment. I think the American people made the decision that they were going to shut the Obama administration down, and I think they did that because both there and at the United Nations, there is just a blatant lack of leadership. And frankly, your word is your bond in diplomacy and national security and law and life. And this administration has broken their word from the line in the sand to everything else. And what it does is it upsets all the conditions of predictability and creates an environment of relative chaos and randomness, and people don't know what to trust. And so, of course, Putin stepped into the mix and provided a degree of predictability, which is, his management style and respect for democracy is relatively, problematic. But at the same time, he went in and essentially has said, chaos cannot reign forever, and I think that it blinks into a different issue altogether, and that is the question of where they will go with the State Department, presumably under Tillerson, in this cycle. And I'm actually very pleased about that. I don't know the man, but I have to tell you, as a choice, I think it's a great out-of-the-box choice. He's an internationalist. He's Exxon, as you probably know, has operations in almost every single country in the world. His relationships with leaders around the world are already deep. And while, of course, you have to put some conflicts of interest, legal provisions out there to make sure that, everything's transparent, the truth is I think we're very lucky to have an internationalist who's already trusted in that sphere. International diplomacy, whether it's the UN or the State Department, requires more than anything else trust on the part of the parties that are facing each other in a discussion. And that's really a one-on-one. It's an eyeball-to-eyeball assessment of whether you can or can't trust this person to get an outcome. Historically, we've kind of slapped Johnny-come-lately diplomats into positions like this, or politicians, God forbid. And you can see from the last two secretaries of state, where a politician gets you. And what has come out of what I think you get in this instance is you get somebody with a depth of cultural understanding about these countries, somebody who, if you think about it for a minute, when he negotiates agreements on oil for America and for an American company, he has to get an outcome. You can't just push paper and pretend you got something. It's a real outcome. You have to enforce it. You have to believe it's going to happen. And so that's why I think there's a discussion about Russia. He's gotten Putin to say and do what he needs to do.
Yeah, but there's something in it for him because he's made millions of dollars.
What's that?
I said there's something in it for him because Rex has made millions of dollars by pushing Putin to sign certain deals.
Well, that's what a deal is.
And, think about it for a minute. He's worked for the shareholders of a major American company. Now, all of a sudden, we average Americans, become his shareholders. And, the other thing about him is his management style is exceptional. It's very similar, I think, to George Shultz's management style. George Shultz was probably one of the best secretaries of state of the last 50 or 60 years. He came out of Bechtel. George Shultz did.
Good point.
And net, I think there are elements of Tillerson who, he'll be a trusted party, unlike this UN or a State Department where you really are getting something you didn't want, and frankly, they can't even hold foreign countries to that kind of a standard, even if they, when they get something.
Well, but beyond Tillerson, I mean, we're so focused, everybody's obsessing about Tillerson because, of course, he's the head of Exxon and because he is from the private sector. But no matter how talented you are, Trump and his administration and Secretary of State to be Tillerson, they are inheriting, to continue the oil metaphor, burning oil derricks all over the world, I should say. How, no matter what skill set you bring to the table, how do you align America's interests with an Iran that has been given the green light for nuclear weapon and regional hegemony? How do you align America's interests with brutal dictators like Assad? And if you're not going to align interests, which probably is not possible or prudent, then how do you blunt their interests?
Well, I think whether you're talking Taiwan or Syria or Russia, here's the good news. The good news is diplomacy is an incremental process, and it's a chess game. That's a fair metaphor. It's not a boxing match typically. The interesting part is when you go to, quote, align those interests, which means how do we serve the interests of the United States of America everywhere in the world? How do we advance our interests vis-a-vis these other parties? There are some parties where, frankly, we're going to have to start from scratch, and they're going to need to understand where we come from, and Iran is one of those parties. Russia certainly is one of those parties, but I think we have a lot more in common with the Russian people than most people realize. Ronald Reagan saw that right off the bat. That's probably the largest Christian nation on the face of the earth. There's a great deal more that we can do with those people who are freedom-loving people, but have a government right now that's run by a guy that used to be part of the KGB. So you've got to be savvy, and you've got to be thoughtful about it. But you can find an alignment of interest, and you can also you can go a step beyond that. Leadership is really the whole ball of wax. When you go to deal with a foreign country or even a region or even an alliance, you have to have credibility. And what has happened over the last 8 years is we've had no credibility. Frankly, Colin Powell had great credibility with George W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan had great credibility because they said something and they meant it. The Soviets were terrified of Ronald Reagan long before we as Americans realized how terrified they were, because he fired the air traffic controllers. He had said, if you violate the law, you will be fired. And he gave 48 hours for them to come back. Turns out years later, when they interviewed the Politburo, they said to one another, holy crap, this guy means guy means what he says. And look what he says. He says we're going to end up on the dust heap of history.
Well, considering
no kidding.
Considering Russia's involvement in Syria, though, doesn't it give you pause to know that, if the Kremlin, they're giving out high fives to each other? One leader said this is some kind of Christmas gift from the American people to the Russian people.
No. You have to think. So I'm going to say something that's purely my own thinking, but
okay.
You have to think out of the box. You have to think bigger. Here's the idea. We have dealt, believe it or not, with people with dictatorial temperaments all over the world for the last 150 years, probably longer than that, actually. And there are people you need to deal with. There are also people you need to transition out, even as you work with somebody that's working with them to get them to do what you want them to do. There is such a thing, too, as a grand bargain. I'll throw an idea out on the table. I think there is a possibility that if you can work closely with the Europeans, with the Russians, ultimately you can create an environment where let's do them in sequence. You get the Europeans, the Russians, the Americans, and the Ukrainians to a table, and you work out the Ukrainian problem. Now we've taken that off the table. A combination of agreements on sovereignty, economic components. By the way, Tillerson happens to be great on economic diplomacy. Mm-hmm. You get that locked down, and at the same time, you now look over here at Assad, and you also look and say, look, we have no interest in this Iran agreement. This Iran agreement is a great big farce. So it's a dangerous farce. So we are not going to play that game anymore. Here's the deal. We will work with you on a transition out for Assad. We will work with you on stabilizing Aleppo. We will work with you as you work with Assad to create a transition out for him. At the same time, for that concession, you're going to stop supporting Iran, and you're going to support us in backing away from or reimposing sanctions when they violate that accord. The last thing I'll throw out on the table, and it's a really wild card, but I haven't said this before, but I'll say it. Imagine if, within the dictates of certain diplomatic norms, which mean you have to let people know what you're thinking about doing, imagine if, just for what it's worth, Trump or somebody else I'll say Trump, were able to, he's already talked with something like 40 different world leaders. Imagine if he could have several conversations, and maybe others had conversations with him, with Putin. And they said, look, we've got a humanitarian disaster right now in Aleppo. Open up a corridor to Turkey. Open up a corridor for these people to safely get out of Aleppo. Stop the bombing. Get Assad to pull back, and let's stop this humanitarian crisis in the depth of winter in Aleppo. I'll be honest with you. If he did that, that would be more than Obama's done in 8 years.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Good thoughts, provocative thoughts. He is Robert Charles, former Assistant Secretary of State from 2003 to 2005 in the W administration, now the president of the Charles Group. Robert Charles, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.